There are moments in the life of a city when you can feel the ground shift beneath a man's feet, and he is the only one in the room who does not notice it yet. That is where Mayor Johnson of Chicago finds himself tonight. And I want to tell you what is happening to him right now. The collapse of his standing, the open revolt inside his own police department, the spectacle of a mayor pleading for cooperation from the very people he spent 2 years lecturing. None of it surprises me. Not one bit. Because here is the iron law of politics, and it never bends. When you build an administration on slogans instead of substance, on the applause of people who will never have to live with the consequences, eventually the bill comes due. Eventually the curtain gets pulled back, and when it does, no amount of righteous language can put it back. That is what we are watching in Chicago. We are watching the curtain come down. Let us go back. Because to understand the man begging for mercy tonight, you have to understand the man who walked into the office certain he would never have to. Think about what it looked like in the beginning. Johnson won with 53% of the vote. He had the endorsement of every major progressive organization in the city. He had a city council that leaned his direction. He had a national media infrastructure that wanted, badly, to write his success story. The conditions for a genuinely transformative mayoralty were as close to ideal as Chicago politics ever allows. A hopeful city handed a hopeful man almost everything he needed. I want you to hold that picture in your mind as we go through what followed. Because the collapse we are witnessing is not the story of a man defeated by forces beyond his control. It is the story of a man who was given every advantage and chose, at every critical juncture, performance over governance. November of his first year. Johnson had been mayor for barely 6 months, and the city was already uneasy. Crime ticking up, businesses quietly drifting to the suburbs, a police force stretched thin and demoralized. And what did the new mayor choose as his signature moment? He convened a press conference at City Hall, cameras lined up 3 deep, and announced that Chicago would become, in his words, a city of refuge, that he would personally guarantee no city resource, no city officer, no city dollar would ever cooperate with federal immigration authorities under any circumstance. He did not consult his police superintendent. He did not consult the rank and file. He did not consult the neighborhoods on the south and west sides who would actually live with the fallout. He stood at that podium chin up and made a promise to a national audience that he had no earthly ability to keep, because he had never once asked the people who would have to keep it whether they could. He wanted the headline. He got the headline. And the officers watching that broadcast in their squad rooms understood something in that instant that took the rest of the city 2 years to figure out. That was the tell. That was the moment you could see, if you were paying attention, exactly who Johnson was. A man who mistook the sound of his own voice for the act of governing. A man who cared, deeply and genuinely, about how he was perceived in the act of caring, and had no real interest in the harder, quieter, less photogenic work of whether any of it actually held together once the cameras left. And for 2 years, the press in this town made sure you never saw it that way. Let me be honest about something, because somebody has to be. The Chicago media did not cover this mayor. They protected him. They were not reporters. They were a personal protection detail with press badges. Every time the police union raised an alarm, it was framed as reactionary obstruction. Every time a neighborhood leader complained that response times were ballooning, it was buried on page 9. Every time someone questioned whether the sanctuary policy was actually workable, not whether it was compassionate, whether it was workable, they were told they were giving comfort to extremists. Any criticism of Johnson's competence was instantly translated into a criticism of his values and then dismissed as bad faith. And so the people of this city went 2 full years without a single honest accounting of what their mayor was actually doing, of whether any of it actually functioned, of what it was actually costing them. Think about what that means in practice. It means that when the police department's own internal reports showed response times rising in high-crime districts, those numbers did not make the evening news. It means that when the city's budget office quietly circulated memos warning that the reserve fund projections were not survivable, that story ran once, briefly, and was not followed. It means that when community organizers in Englewood and Austin and Auburn Gresham, neighborhoods Johnson invoked by name at every fundraiser, started saying publicly that nothing had changed, that the infrastructure was still crumbling, and the schools were still understaffed, and the corner stores were still closing. Those voices were given 30 seconds at the end of a segment and never called back. The narrative was set. Johnson was the story Chicago needed. Adjusting that narrative would have required admitting they had oversold it. And nobody in that business wanted to do that. Well, they are getting that accounting now. And I promise you, it is not pretty. Let us talk about the legacy, the word his staff loves, the legacy, as if repeating it in enough fundraising emails will conjure it into existence. What exactly has Johnson built in his time in office? Let us go through it honestly. He passed one signature ordinance, the so-called Community Trust Act, which he sold to the public as a measure that would make every resident safer by ensuring nobody feared calling the police. A beautiful sentiment, and in practice, crime reporting in the affected districts did not rise. It fell, because the policy did nothing to address why people did not trust the police and everything to advertise that City Hall and the department were now at war with each other. He sold it as protection. It functioned as paralysis. Then there was his budget, which he called the most progressive in the city's history. A document so loaded with promises and so light on revenue that the city's own financial officer warned in writing that it would blow a 9-figure hole in the reserves within 3 years. Johnson called that officer alarmist. The hole is now real. And then there was the promise. The one he repeated at every rally, every ribbon cutting, every town hall. No neighborhood left behind. Say it with me, because he said it 1,000 times. No neighborhood left behind. It was not a goal. It was not an aspiration. It was a slogan he knew he could not deliver, deployed precisely because it sounded like a commitment while requiring nothing of him. The neighborhoods got left behind. They always do. That sentence alone should have been disqualifying. And here is the part nobody at City Hall wants to discuss, the wreckage. Because a mayor's failures are never abstractions. Somebody pays. So, who paid for Johnson's 2-year performance? The cops did. The ones told to enforce contradictory orders from leadership that despised them. The officers who would show up to a community meeting and get lectured by an alderman reading from a City Hall talking point, while the block behind them had 3 open gang cases going unsolved. The small business owners on the corridors who watched their windows broken and their 911 calls go unanswered for 40 minutes, and who eventually did what small business owners always do when a city stops protecting them. They left. Quietly, without a press conference, they pulled their signs down, and their families moved somewhere else, and the storefronts went dark. That is the economics of a failed safety policy. Not a headline, just a dark window on a block that used to have a light on. The working families in the very neighborhoods Johnson swore to protect, who did not get a press conference, who did not get a national television hit, who just got more of the same and were told to be grateful for the symbolism. Those people do not have lobbyists. They do not have publicists. They have a quarterly approval survey, and they used it. And 21% is what they said. And the immigrant communities themselves, used as a backdrop for a mayor's brand, promised sanctuary, and then left exposed when the federal pressure arrived, and Johnson discovered, to his apparent shock, that a mayor cannot actually nullify federal law from a podium. Those people trusted him. Every one of them trusted him. And one by one they figured out that the trust ran in only one direction. Last month, the city's own quarterly survey put Johnson's approval at 21%. 21. The lowest of any mayor in Chicago's recorded history. That is not a polling blip. That is a city rendering its verdict. Now let us talk about what has emerged since, because this is the heart of it. 3 weeks ago, the Chicago Police Benevolent Association did something no police union in this city's history had ever done. After a federal enforcement operation that the mayor's office had publicly vowed to obstruct, internal communications surfaced, leaked, then confirmed by the union's own counsel, showing that Johnson's senior staff had quietly instructed the department to stand down and avoid any confrontation with federal agents, even as the mayor was on camera promising the opposite. 2 messages, 2 faces. In public, defiance. In private, get out of the way and do not make us liable. And when the rank and file saw those messages, the dam broke. The union voted no confidence at 89%. The superintendent's deputies began openly contradicting City Hall in press statements. And Johnson, the man who 2 years ago would not return the union president's calls, called an emergency closed-door meeting and, according to 3 people in that room, asked the officers, asked them, to please not go public, to please give him room, to please work with him. The man who built his brand on never needing the police was, behind that door, begging them for cover. Now I will be fair, because fairness is the whole point. Some defenders have noted, correctly, that a stand-down order to avoid a violent clash with federal agents may have been the legally prudent call. Fine. Concede it. That is not the scandal. The scandal is that he did one thing in private and sold the opposite in public, and used his own officers as the props in a performance he knew was false. Whether every memo was technically lawful does not change 1 inch of what it reveals. Because it is a pattern, it runs through the entire Johnson era like a thread. You saw it in the Inspector General's report, quietly released on a Friday before a holiday, finding that his office had steered no-bid communications contracts to a firm run by a former campaign aide. You saw it in the abrupt resignation of his ethics commissioner, who left with a statement saying only that she could no longer do the job as she understood it. You saw it in the surveillance scandal. When it emerged, the city had been quietly monitoring the social media of activists who had criticized the mayor, the same mayor who had campaigned, hand on heart, as the great defender of dissent. You saw it in the way every internal critic was reassigned, every whistleblower marginalized, every uncomfortable number disputed rather than answered. One bad decision is a mistake. This is architecture. This is a way of governing in which the rules are understood to apply to everyone except the people writing them. And here is where I want to step back, because the grievances are not the real story. The real story is the man, and the flaw he could never see in himself. Johnson's tragedy is not that he was corrupt. There are more corrupt men. His tragedy is that he was hollow in a specific, recognizable way. He fell in love with the description of leadership and never developed the stomach for the practice of it. He could deliver a soaring speech about a city where no one is afraid, and then return to an office governed by grievance and grudge. He could invoke unity at a podium while his staff was busy settling scores. The gap between the words and the work was not a failure of execution. It was the whole man. And if you want a monument to it, drive down to the lakefront and look at the Johnson Civic Pavilion, the gleaming community center he broke ground on in his first year, promising it would be the beating heart of the South Side. 4 years later, it stands half-finished, fenced off, 300% over budget, a rusting steel skeleton open to the weather. The neighborhood it was supposed to serve walks past it every day on the way to nothing. He poured the city's money and his own vanity into a structure that was always more about the ribbon cutting than the building, and now it sits there, unfinished, unusable, a perfect concrete confession. If you wanted a metaphor for Johnson, you could not build one more honest than that. And let me say one thing clearly, because it needs saying. Last week, a crude doctored image of the mayor and his family circulated online. Vile, dehumanizing, the kind of thing that has no place in our politics, no matter who the target is. Johnson condemned it. He was right to. And so do I. You can believe, as I do, that this man failed Chicago at nearly every turn, and still believe without contradiction that he and his family are human beings entitled to basic decency. Those two things are not in conflict. The people who will use the legitimate case against this mayor as cover to be cruel are not on my side, and they are not on yours. Make the case on the record. The record is more than enough. I want to address something directly because I know exactly how these conversations get framed. The moment you lay this out, someone says you are just a hater, that you never wanted Johnson to succeed, that this is personal. It is not. I wanted him to succeed. This city needed him to succeed. The case against him is not built on spite. It is built on 21% approval, an 89% no-confidence vote, an unfinished pavilion, a leaked memo, and an inspector general's report. That is not my opinion. That is the receipts. And here is the irony of it. The irony history seems to specialize in. Johnson's own record has done more to expose Johnson than any critic ever could. Time does that. The signature ordinance backfired. The budget is bleeding. The police he disdained have publicly broken with him. The activists he surveilled have turned on him. The neighborhoods he swore to lift have given him their answer. The pavilion stands empty. The man who promised refuge could not even keep the loyalty of his own officers. He was handed every advantage, a sympathetic press, a hopeful city, a mandate most mayors only dream of, and he squandered it. Not because the opposition was too fierce, not because the problems were too hard, but because the distance between the man he believed himself to be and the man he actually was had simply grown too wide to cross. There is something worth saying about the specific shape of that kind of failure, because it is more common in politics than we like to admit. It is the failure of the person who rises on the quality of their convictions and discovers, once in office, that conviction is not the same thing as capacity. Johnson believed in things. He believed in them sincerely. The problem was never his values. The problem was that he treated his values as a substitute for the unglamorous, grinding, relationship-dependent work of actually running a city. He thought that wanting the right things meant he was doing the right things. He thought that being on the correct side of history absolved him of the responsibility of delivering results. And when the results did not come, when the budget bled and the pavilion rusted and the neighborhoods did not rise, he did what people do when they have confused identity with competence. He blamed the resistance. He blamed the press when it finally turned. He blamed the federal government. He blamed the police union. He blamed everyone within reach except the man whose name was on the office door. That is not resilience. That is the last refuge of someone who never truly internalized that the job was his to do. That press conference in his first November was the first warning sign. The man who thought he could rewrite federal law and command a department's loyalty with a single broadcast, who never asked the people who would have to carry it whether it could be carried. It took the rest of Chicago a while to catch up to what those officers understood that day in their squad rooms. But the reckoning has arrived, and it was, as it turns out, inevitable. You cannot govern a city on a slogan and hope nobody ever checks whether it was true. Somebody always checks. The residents check. The officers check. The budget office checks. History checks. And when they check, they do not grade on sincerity. They grade on results. The results are a 21% approval rating, an 89% no-confidence vote from the people sworn to keep the city safe, a half-built monument to a man's ego sitting rusted on the lakefront, and a city that is quieter now, more tired than angry, trying to figure out how it moves forward from here. History will not remember Johnson the way his supporters hoped. It will remember him the way the evidence demands,